The legend of the 10 lost tribes of Israel has been a mysterious one. Multiple Bible scholars have debated and identified many modern races as being the northern kingdom of Israel. Among these, the most popular are the Aborigines of the Western Hemisphere, or the earlier civilizations of Europe. All groups base their conclusions on prophecy and speculative geographical indicators of Arsareth. An examination of the tribe's migrational patterns according to the writings of Esdras supports only land immigration westwards, as a surprise to most. The scripture reads, "Those are the 10 tribes which were carried away prisoner out of their own land in the time of Hosea the king, whom Salmanassar, the king of Assyria, led away captive. And he carried them over the waters. And so came they into another land. But they took this counsel among themselves, that they would leave the multitude of the heathen and go forth into a further country where mankind never dwelt, that they might keep their statutes, which they never kept in their own land. And they entered into the Euphrates by the narrow places of the river. For the Most High then shewed signs for them, and held still the flood, till they were passed over. For through that country there was a great way to go, namely of a year and a half, and the same region is called Arsareth. Then dwelt they there until the latter time, and now when they shall begin to come." 2nd Esdras, chapter 13, verses 40 through 46. Now, before we continue, I would like to highlight a few basic points about this journey. 1, they were going to a new region where civilization had not arisen before. 2, the country did not have established kingdoms or civilizations in it. 3, they would be free to hold true to their culture and under no compulsion to worship other gods. 4, they had to cross the Euphrates at the narrow part to get there. The Israelites had lived in several places already at this time. Also keep in mind that according to the narrative, wherever they lived, the Gentiles had been problematic for their faith, so they decided to go somewhere else. Based on this information, we can rule out places such as Egypt, Mesopotamia, Lebanon, and Palestine. It also most likely rules out Turkey and Greece, being that they had extensive trade and communication since the days of King David and Solomon. They had to either go eastwards beyond Persia or westward beyond Egypt. Another thing to address lies within the scripture itself. The part in question reads, "And they enter into the Euphrates by the narrow places of the river. For the Most High then shewed signs for them, and held still the flood till they were passed over." At first sight, one is tempted to think that God showed them a sign by holding back the Euphrates itself for the people to cross. But after further examination of this, it is apparent that the people had been crossing the Euphrates before without needing a miracle. If God were going to place a miracle at the Euphrates, he wouldn't have bothered to take them to the narrow passages to cross. The story in Esdras say that they crossed and the Most High then shows a sign. This is very reminiscent of the Exodus from Egypt. The cloud and the pillar of fire did not appear to the Hebrews until they stepped out of Egypt. From there, they were led through the wilderness to the Red Sea, where God parted the waters. Here in circa 722 BC, it could be understood that God waited for the tribes to step over the Euphrates in faith. Then he was able to lead them. It could also be understood that the flood that was held back is referring to the annual flooding of the Tigris and Euphrates River. Every year, floods peak in April and May, and spring snow melts and flows out of modern-day Iran unchecked. One more quick point to make. Every continent on the planet has some inhabitants at the very least. This includes North and South America, contrary to popular belief. The expression "where no mankind dwelt" simply means that there was no established societies or culture there. We can gather this by knowing that they, the Israelites, were already a nomadic priestly class of people with no real home base according to the narrative of the Bible. So a look at the established cultures in the region might give an indication of where this land actually is. So let's build a quick timeline. About 1000 BC, we see several kingdoms fighting for supremacy in this region. To the east of Assyria are the Medes, Persians, Parthians, Aryans spreading in India, and the emerging Chinese and Korean tribes. Northwards are the Phrygians. To the west is Arabia or Havila, with its nomadic tribes, as well as the declining Egyptian kingdom, which is the only established civilization in the realm we refer to as Africa. There were no known kingdoms west of Egypt at this time. Around 700 BC, soon after the Hebrew tribes migrated out of Assyria, the dominions of the territories began to change. We see the rise of the Persian Empire, which now covers most of the Middle East. India with its city-states is east of this empire, and beyond the mountains are the Chinese. To the north are the Greeks, which are now the major force in Europe, but very specifically in the Aegean Sea area. To the west, Africa and Arabia are still predominantly made up of scattered nomadic tribes and hunters. With that, I propose the people who are referred to as the Qumri by the Assyrians and Greeks are the ancestors of the Celtic races, which are the lost tribes who settled in northwest Europe and the region of Armorica. These tribes are also identified in historical records as Teutonic races, the Sake or the Scythians, the Anglo-Saxons or the angelic sons of Isaac, the Gauls, the original English, and the Tuatha De Danann. From there, smaller remnants of these groups migrated further west into the Americas and established societies there among the indigenous groups that were already there that are not mentioned in the Bible. So let's look at what archaeological and primary evidence substantiates this. The Assyrian cuneiform tablets, translated by Professor Leroy Waterman at the University of Michigan, reveals that the Israelites, originally known to the Assyrians as Qumri, were placed in captivity near the river Habor and in river Gozan near the Medes in northern Iran. Some of the different appellations of the word Qumri is Simri, Gomri, Omri, and Amiri. Remember that one for later. During this captivity, the Israelites were renamed Gamira and Semidians. That was the way the Assyrians pronounced Kimbri. Although they occupied the land of the Medes, they were distinctly a different people. The black stone, known as the Black Obelisk, depicts Shalmaneser's victory over several kingdoms. The stone was found by Austin Layard and is stored at the British Museum. In the second row from the top is a carving of Jehu bowing down to the ground, while his servant presents him gifts. On the obelisk, Jehu is called the Bit of Omri, meaning house of Omri. It would make sense that the Assyrians in this period used the phrase house of Omri to refer to the northern kingdom of Israel. Jehu was the son of Omri, an Israelite king. Also, according to Britannica, the oldest archaeological evidence of the Celts comes from Halsa in Austria near Salzburg. Excavated graves of chieftains date back to 700 BC, which aligns with the assumed timeline of this migration. Another point to add when dealing with records is renowned historian Flavius Josephus. He states that the entire body of the people of Israel remain in that country, wherefore there are 2 tribes in Asia and Europe subject to the Romans, while 10 tribes are beyond the Euphrates till now and are an immense multitude. This provides insight to the general political landscape of these tribes in their respective regions. This is even more interesting because that the Israelites wouldn't have returned to the promised land at this point, and he died in circa 100 AD. This would mean that a general knowledge of the location and political climate of the lost tribes was known to them at this time. The writings of Josephus so happen to correlate with the 29th chapter of Acts, also known as the Sonnini Manuscript. In fairness to intellectual honesty, no trace of the original Greek manuscript has been found to date, and for this reason, the document is considered by most scholars as a fake. However, according to the history we do have, we know that the document was purchased with the selling of Sir John Newport's library in Ireland. The book itself was a document presented to Sonnini from the Sultan Abdul Ahmet of Turkey, from the archives of Constantinople. According to historical sources, the document appeared at a time when supposedly a new understanding was rising, that the Britons were a part of the lost tribes of Israel. Few have considered that if a Frenchman had been handed the original, he would most certainly hand it over to his Pope Father or the Catholic authority for verification. The original would never be heard of again if glorified holy links to Britain. This actually poses an interesting question based on the collection of facts that attest to these Celtic races having links to these lost tribes. Should we look at the removed chapter as being eradicated from all copies of the Acts of the Apostles, specifically to nullify any notion of the British and their claim to testing primacy over Rome? Acts chapter 29 verses 3 through 7. And the Lord commanded the gospel to be preached far hence to the Gentiles, and to the lost sheep of the house of Israel. And no man hindered Paul, for he testified boldly of Jesus before the tribunes and among the people. And he took with him certain of the brethren, which abode with him at Rome. And they took shipping at Ostium, and having the winds fair, were brought safely into a haven of Spain. And much people were gathered together from the towns and villages, and the hill country, for they had heard of the conversion of the apostle, and the many miracles which he had wrought. And Paul preached mightily in Spain, and great multitudes believed and were converted, for they perceived he was an apostle sent from God. And they departed out of Spain, and Paul and his company, finding a ship in Armorica, sailed unto Britain. It would be reasonable to conclude that during this time, Paul visited Andalusia, also known as Spain, as he had planned this already according to Romans chapter 15 verses 28, and he preached to the lost sheep who are scripturally implied to be the northern kingdom of Israel. So, really quick, let's recap. According to the writings of Esdras, the northern kingdom of Israel collectively decided to migrate into the area outside of the jurisdiction of the Assyrians. Most archaeological and primary sources point to this collection of people migrating west into the northwestern regions of Europe and the Iberian Peninsula, adopting different names along the way. St. Paul, Flavius Josephus, and Sonnini all confirm this as well. These facts, plus more, would result in the conclusion that the region referred to as Arsareth in the scripture is referring to a region in Europe in which the Hebrews passed through in order to reach their destination. The term Arsareth is a perversion of the term Ararat, as clearly shown in biblical translations, which comes from the Babylonian Aratu, which is a region of Armenia. The Hebrews traveled through Arsareth, not to it. Now, if we were to assume that this is all factual, how would we then explain the presence of the Hebrews already in America pre-Columbus? For those who aren't aware, there is plenty of evidence to support the idea that the Hebrews were already in the Americas before the arrival of any colonial power. From the Back Creek Stone to the Los Lunas Decalogue to the Judaic symbols found at Uxmal, to the similarities of certain words in the Uto-Nawalt dialect to Aramaic and Hebrew. There is clearly a connection in the Americas to the Hebrews. I propose this ethnogenesis happened somewhere around 100 BC. In the 1920s, archaeologists in Tucson, Arizona found objects and writings in Latin, Greek, and Hebrew with both Catholic and Jewish ritual objects and symbols. Cyclone Covey describes this discovery in his book, Calalus, a Roman Jewish colony in America from the time of Charlemagne through Alfred the Great. In this area specifically, and other areas in the Americas, are found mixtures of Jewish, Nordic, Christian, Hindu, and Kabbalistic objects and symbols. The records of Calalus speak of a Theodorus, a man who led a group of people to the land of Calalus in 775 AD. Theodorus in reality is the king of Septimania, a Roman Jewish state in southern France, also known as Gaul or Armorica. He is the son of the first Israelite king of Septimania, also called Theodoric, Theori, or Amiri. Similar to the appellation of Simri that we referred to earlier, right? Theodorus is also known as Theodoric, king of Saxony, and as Namus, duke of Bavaria. He and his brother were great warriors during the time of Charlemagne. Professor Arthur Zuckerman, in his book, A Jewish Princedom in Feudal France, confuses him with his father, who bears the same Frankish name of Theodoric and Emiri. On the death of his father, Makir Theodoric, in about 765 AD, Nehemiah Theodoric becomes the Western Exarch and leader of all Jews of the revived Western Roman Empire of Charlemagne. In 775 AD, Theodoric reconquered the American empire Calalus from the indigenous people, which was at the time ruled by Sylvanus Toltexes, or nicknamed by them Solomon the Builder. Calalus was founded in the 1st century BC by the Babylonian exarch known as Sylvanus Ogan, or Sylvanus Brabo, the ruler of Sumer, which is Somerset in Britain, a soldier and ancestor of the Swan Knights. After the defeat of Sylvanus Toltexes, the members of the royal family were sent back to Europe, where they were under the protection of Nehemiah Theodorus and his family. The legends of Dune and Ogier are based on the activities of this family. The legends of Ogier the Dane, son of Godfrey, and Dune the Menace actually refer to the Tuath de Danann, Manannan, or the god of the sea, which could be made synonymous with Maine in America. The Irish legend of Regamon also allude to this family. This could also explain the origins of the understanding of the Mormon Church. Keep in mind that Joseph Smith was a known Freemason and possibly a converso Jew based on his surname being connected to crypto-Jews, meaning that he was accustomed to seeing things in signs and codes. The Mormons claim that the prophet Mormon lived during the 4th century, but history and signs allude to him living closer to the 9th. During the lifetime of Charlemagne, Morvan or Mormon had been a faithful vassal to the Frankish Empire, despite a Breton revolt in 811. With Morvan having been declared the king of Britain shortly after Charlemagne's death, the integrity of the Frankish Empire was threatened because of the other regional vassals' threat to go their own way. King Louis the Pious of the Frankish Empire sends Abbot Witcher to negotiate with Mormon, which fails. Louis assembles an army in the spring of 818 at Vannes within the Breton March, which at this point is controlled by the Franks. With Lambert of Nantes in support, he launches a series of attacks against various Breton forces, and after Mormon is killed in battle, resistance collapses. This story somewhat parallels the story of the Prophet Mormon. The Prophet Mormon was a man who lived in ancient America, supposedly. He was chosen by Yahushua HaMashiach, or Jesus Christ, to preserve and protect the sacred records, as well as add his own history and experiences to them. The records which he wrote and preserved would later become the Book of Mormon. Members of the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints recognize and acknowledge the Book of Mormon as a scripture, a holy writing that's similar to the Holy Bible. Aside from being a prophet and historian, Mormon was a leader who commanded many military troops in his native army. Mormon was born, raised, and was a part of the Nephite civilization, a race of God-fearing people who once inhabited ancient America according to the narrative of the story. At the age of 10, Mormon was approached by an ancient record keeper named Amorites, which sounds very similar to Amorian, which was a class of rabbinical scholars that maintained the original understanding of the Torah and Tanakh in the 3rd and 4th centuries. Amorites was ordered by God to take care and cautiously keep a series of valuable historical records which were written on thin gold plates. The importance of these records is huge considering that it contains hundreds of years of history and has survived the test of time as it has been transferred from one generation to the next. Amorites hid the records and buried them in a hill. Amorites told Mormon that when he reaches the age of 24, he would then find all the records that he had hidden. At 16, he was chosen as commander of the Nephite armies. Though he's considered a great military leader, his forces were not strong enough to fight and defend. The battle left thousands of people dead. Mormon was also wounded, which forced him to hide and bury many of the sacred records. He gave some of the on-hand records to his son Moroni and instructed him to write about the final history of their people. As a good son, Moroni gave his contribution to the record and followed his father's order of burying the completed records again. Now, interestingly enough, there is an obvious connection to Armorica in Brittany in antiquity dating back to, ironically, the 4th century, the same time period in which the Mormon Church places Mormon, the prophet, in history. Nevertheless, this is important because of the similarities in the names that were chosen to reflect this story. For an example, the prophet Mormon, Mor, passes his records on to his son Moroni, Mar. This is very similar to the name of the tribe of Armorican Romano-Bretons known as Morini. This also adds a level of intrigue, as knowing the people we modernly refer to as Vikings descend from this group of people. The Vikings on record technically have one of the oldest established territories, Lonzo Meadows, in Newfoundland in the Americas dating back to 1000 AD. Artifacts such as the Kensington Stone, a large slab of gray wax stone covered in Nordic runes found in Minnesota, or the Burrow Cave artifacts in Illinois would suggest that these Vikings, Armoricans, Cimmerians, or Hebrews established themselves amongst the northeastern American seaboard and possibly further. Also keep in mind that Joseph Smith was instructed to receive these alleged gold plates in upstate New York, so there could possibly be a connection there as well.
Anyway, so what do we know about the Mulekite language? Well, according to the text, we really can't say that we know anything, but we're going to show you a few things. Judeo-Aztecan has 3 separate sets of data from the Near East, from Near Eastern languages. About 400 matches with Egyptian. That's a goodly amount. About 700 matches with Hebrew Aramaic. And it's kind of like a Hebrew Aramaic mix. In fact, it might even be more heavily Aramaic and less Hebrew. And they have those 2 bodies of data have the same sound correspondences with each other. So that Semitic Aramaic Hebrew has the same sound correspondence as the Egyptian, which means that they're probably spoken or come from the same people. However, there are also about 400 matches with Phoenician, but an entirely different set of sound correspondences, meaning that it was spoken by a different people. It came from a different source. It changed in different ways. Now, Phoenician is basically the same as Hebrew. Hebrew is simply Hebrew and Phoenician and Canaanite are all 3 the same language, different dialects. Hebrew is the Israelite dialect of Phoenician or Canaanite. However, Phoenician, well, we'll get into that later. So many ask why the Nephites and Mulekites could not understand each other if they both left Jerusalem just 400 years earlier. For a number of reasons. In fact, let me explain at least 3 reasons. First of all, tone, accent patterns can throw people off and can change languages in ways that make it very quickly non-understandable. For example, I just retired from teaching English for 35 years, and I will do this exercise. Well, let's see. No, let me back up a little bit. Take a couple of sentences. For example, what's that in the road ahead? Versus, what's that in the road ahead? Now see, they're both questions, and so you'd think, well, a question has a rising tone at the end, right? But even though they're both questions, they have different tone patterns, and the tone pattern gives it a different meaning. Let me give you another example. This I say to my classes. I'm going to say something, and you tell me what I said. And this is English. Mechanical ability. Mechanical ability. Now, what I really said was mechanical ability, but the general accent or tone pattern on both of those words, they're both 4-syllable words, and generally the second syllable is stressed or accented. Mechanical ability. All I did was remove that accent or stress from the second syllable and put on the first and third instead. Mechanical ability. And nobody understood it. Just with a different accent, different tone pattern. Now let me give you another example. This is a sentence, this is a complete sentence that we used to say in the neighborhood I grew up in Los Angeles. All the kids in the neighborhood would say this full sentence this way. And you all know exactly what I said, right? I don't know. Now it's interesting because in the first one, I give you all of the sounds, I give you all of the consonants and the vowels, but a different tone pattern, and everybody misses it. But on the second one, I give you none of the sounds, none of the consonants or vowels, only the tone pattern. And you know exactly what I said without any of the sounds. Now, isn't that interesting?
What is a cognate? A cognate is a word having the same linguistic origin as another, from the same original word or root. For an example, the English word is and German ist both come from the Latin est. Another example is the English word night. In French, it is nuit. In Spanish, it is noche. In German, it is Nacht, which all derives from the Indo-European term Nok. We can use this as a means of identifying specific time periods of cultural exchange between different groups of people. In the case of the Aboriginal inhabitants of the Americas, we see multiple instances of different indigenous language families sharing cognates with Aramaic, Hebraic, Egyptian, and Phoenician words and names. Dr. Brian D. Stubbs have found several traces of these language families in Uto-Aztecan languages like Nahuatl. His book, Uto-Aztecan, A Comparative Vocabulary, is the most extensive in the field. In it, he reveals with his meticulous research that the number of correspondence discovered far exceeds any number of random chances according to linguistic theory. In the book, Carolina Genesis, Beyond the Color Lines, it reads, the earliest appearance of a variant of the name Amorgaricacon in the land that eventually became the United States is recorded by the Spanish in 1680 as Amacaris, a tribal name contained in the title of the Florida mission, El Nombre de Dios de Amacaris, which is acknowledged as a Yamasee town located in the Temuca province of La Florida. Swanton applied the name Amacaris as the original name for the Yamacraw. An abbreviated form of the name Yamasee appears in South Carolina, recorded as Amasi. The compounded prefixes Amorgari and Amacari are similar. Amor or ama from the Spanish denotes beloved, probably derived from the Sephardic Amora, and Gari or Gale denotes people in the Muskegon language family. And so Amagari and Amakari of a bilingual etymology is roughly translated as the beloved people. South Carolina public records prior to the Yamasee War in 1715 mentioned the Yamasee as Amercario or Amacario of the Westogo, also known as the Savannah River Yamiscaron. A variant for Yamasee was given by Francisco de Chicora circa 1721 when he was held in captivity by the Spanish. It goes on to read, the Matoic suffix kakan implies the act of teaching, interpreting, or speaking. Therefore, Amorgarikakan can be translated as the beloved people who interpret. Within the context of the name Amorgarikakan, the native root words appear to have derived from the Muskegon and the Matoic language families, expanding the Atlantic seaboard south to north or vice versa. So, simply put, we can identify the cultural fusion of the Hebrews and the Aboriginals of America by following the linguistic connections of the two groups. All of the different appellations of Moor, Amorgari, Amakari, Amacario, Amorium, Amorica, etc. all point to the same source. Now, before we continue, I would like to bring this in full context. If you've watched the last two episodes of the Inquisition series, The Conspiracy of Chronology, outlining the proof of colonial powers by way of the Vatican altering and disguising history, and Mafioso, detailing how the Pope has gained control over most of the world and the people in it by means of papal bulls, you'd see that the objective of the Roman Catholic Church is to gain legal and political jurisdiction over the original civilizations of Earth by means of ecclesiastical systems and the altering of cultural or religious narratives for means of gain. An ecclesiastical system, in short, is a system in which an executor, which could be a pope, chief, pastor, sheep, high priest, etc., holds title to property and manages said assets for the benefit of another, which in this particular case would be the church. This is the same as what we would call in today's time trust, or the concept of trust law. The entire point of the claim that Hebrews were the first to dwell in or establish civilization in America particularly is to place their own historical marker in which they have legal jurisdiction based upon the fact that their claim to the land can be proven further in history. These lost, quote-unquote, Hebrews have migrated to the Americas, fleeing persecution, are the property of the express trust of the Vatican, thus meaning the territories in which they domicile and own are also property of the Pope. The Johnson versus Emmentoge case of 1823 proves this. Chief Justice Marshall directly traced an English title to land in America to the discovery, quote-unquote, of America by the Italian explorer John Cabot, acting pursuant to letters patent issued in 1498 by King Henry VII's Royal Commission. Pertaining to case law, the Johnson versus Emmentoge case of 1823 proves this. Chief Justice Marshall directly traced an English title to land in America to the quote-unquote discovery of America by Italian explorer John Cabot, acting pursuant to letters patent issued in 1498 by King Henry VII's Royal Commission. This title arose out of the exclusive right of the discoverer to appropriate the lands occupied by the Indians on the basis of a claim of ultimate dominion to be in themselves even while yet in the possession of the natives. The patent granted the right to seek out, discover, and find whatsoever isles, countries, regions, or provinces of the heathen and infidels whatsoever they be, and in what part of the world soever they be. By way of his feudal bond to the Pope as a subditti, or a subject Catholic prince, and by the wording of the letters patent, it is inferred that Henry VII was governed by and subordinate to the papal bulls Romanus Pontifex issued in 1455 and Inter Cantera issued in 1493, respectively decreed by Pope Nicholas V and Pope Alexander VI, giving them a lawful claim to the justification of their continued presence in these said regions. Understanding and comprehending this information begins to bring the entirety of the story into full perspective. Contact with the Americas happened centuries before the arrival of Columbus. These Armorican tribes originally sailed to the west coast of South America, migrated north, and established colonies all throughout the Americas. This is where all the different appellations of the name America likely come from. From the Amorites mountain ranges of Nicaragua to the Amorites tribes of the Atlantic coast, to the Ladino Chichimeca that have been both culturally and genetically tied to the Armorium, which are crypto-Jews. All of these different terms can be connected back to the region of Armorica, which has interesting ties with the Portuguese. In 1492, it is believed that Salvador Fernando Zarco, better known as Cristobal Colon or Christopher Columbus, set sail with 3 small ships to the New World, quote-unquote. Modern scholars and Columbus hobbyists try to associate Salvador or Christopher with Spain, Catalonia, and even Greece, but there is strong case to be made that he was actually Portuguese. According to Augusto Barreto, a Portuguese historian and fencer, Columbus was the bastard son of Prince Fernando, the grandson of navigator João Zarco, a converso Jew. The Portuguese origin thesis has him using Colomb as a pseudonym. Keep in mind that in 1290, the Edict of Expulsion was issued by King Edward I of England to expel all Jews from the Kingdom of England. Luis de Torres was employed by Columbus as an interpreter on his first voyage to the New World. Prior to this, de Torres held a position with Juan Cacon, governor of Murcia, a province where there was a large number of Jews, as a Hebrew interpreter. Because he had Hebraic origins, and this was during the era of the Inquisition, it was necessary for him to convert to Catholicism, which he did the day before the Nina, the Pinta, and the Santa Maria set sail on August 2nd of 1492. The voyage also coincided with the expulsion of all Jews from Spain. So in short, Columbus was likely a Jew. So why is this relevant? Just stick with me. I promise this will make sense soon. Interestingly enough, it is a known fact that some of the earliest inhabitants of that area were known as Iberi or as Iberi, basically meaning Hebrews. From Spain, the Iberi moved onwards into Gaul and the British Isles. The Celtic inhabitants of Britain were all referred to as Iberi or Iberni, meaning Hebrews, by themselves and by others such as Ptolemy. And the name Iberi very frequently occurs in ethnic and place names of Western Celtic peoples. The Iberian Peninsula was named after the Iberi, Hebrews who once dwelt there but later left, moving into Gaul and Brittany. Tracing this history, we can see that these groups of people prior to Catholic influence held their own forms of political governance before being overthrown by the Roman Catholic powers. We see this is as early as the wars between the Romans and the Druids, and as late as the Jacobite Rebellion and the formation of the Covenanters, which was an attempt to maintain their divine right of kingship by means of creating a trust, historically known as the Solemn League of Assembly, to remove themselves from under the ecclesiastical jurisdiction of the Catholic Church. The schism lasted over 800 years between the Catholics and the groups of people we identify as the Hebrews. Throughout this time, many of these Hebrews were made into vassals for various nations that were being controlled by the Roman Curia. These vassals were oftentimes referred to as different appellations of the word Mar or Moor. These Mars or Moors were oftentimes vassals for nations held by puppet leaders with Roman Catholic roots. This was also mentioned in our last episode, Mafioso, how the crown of Aragon was established by the Catholic crown under the papal bull Attorney Regis, which granted these Mars or Moors status under their particular feudal system. In closing, the area known as Arsareth biblically isn't in America, but in Europe, and furthermore, it is a region in which this group of people passed through and not settled in. The tribes that war with King Tiglath-Pileser and found peace with Shalmaneser, king of Assyria, became a conglomerate of people known as Cimmerians or Omri, who migrated through Europe or Arsareth into northwest Europe, specifically with other Germanic tribes. From there, they grew their own culture uninfluenced by the outside world until the time of Frankish king Charlemagne. By this time, many of these Omri were dwelling in the region of Armorica and were made into vassals of the Roman Catholic Church. This is happening around the same time in which these Armoricans are documented as having early settlements in America, thus giving them claim to the land prior to colonialization, according to their maxims of law. From this is where the multitude of Freemasonic and Jesuit connections are made, correlating Hebrews and the Americas. The vassals in which the Catholics used to perpetuate this narrative, the Mars or the Moors, were utilized specifically to push this understanding from a doctrinal standpoint.